Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Wikimedia Research Showcase for September 2021. We're back after a break in August. My name is Martin Gerlach. I'm a research scientist at the Wikimedia Foundation. I am very excited to introduce today's speakers. I really want to thank them to join us here today. We first have Rosta Farzan, an associate professor at the School of Computing and Information at the University of Pittsburgh, and she will talk about unlocking the Wikipedia clubhouse to newcomers, presenting results from two different approaches in engaging new editors in Wikipedia. In the second half, we'll have Nathan Matias, an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Cornell University, where he leads the Citizen and Technology, or short, the CAT lab. He will talk about the effect of receiving appreciation on Wikipedia, reporting results from a field experiment co-designed by the community. We do have some of the collaborators here in the room with us for later in the Q&A. I want to stress that at the end of each talk, we will have hopefully plenty of time for Q&A. So if you have questions for the speakers, please put them in the chat or on IRC. My colleague Pablo Aragon will monitor and relay those questions here. Before we start with Rosta's talk, I want to briefly pass it on to Leila to give some more context around the general theme of socialization on Wikipedia. Leila, are you here?
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I do not hear the room, so I'm going to assume this is my turn to set the context for this showcase. Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. I'm really excited about setting the stage for this research showcase. As some of you know, one of the two pillars of the 2030 Wikimedia movement strategy is focusing on knowledge equity. The direction that the movement has chosen, one of the two directions, we have decided to put a focus on including everyone in the Wikimedia movement, opening the doors and setting a vision that includes everyone who wants to share the vision and mission to join the Wikimedia projects. There are major initiatives within the Wikimedia Foundation at the moment that are going to facilitate this move towards the 2030 knowledge equity strategy. The Knowledge Equity Fund that some of you are aware of, measuring knowledge gaps through knowledge equity through measuring knowledge gaps within the research team, considering more data centers across the globe to improve access, the global advocacy initiatives and the policy initiatives that the foundation is involved with the communities, the growth team's work for helping welcoming the newcomers to the Wikimedia movement and also helping them be more productive. And of course, as always, Wikimedia Foundation does many things, and there are even a lot more that is happening, a lot more exciting, impactful, and highly critical work that is happening outside of the foundation. You're going to hear the notes about like some of these initiatives, art and feminism, women in red, even some of the initiatives that are completely outside of the Wikimedia world, such as the Masakani community, who's attempting to bring more data and models, machine learning models from the South African continent to the web. The education program is a big part of activities for welcoming newcomers to the Wikimedia movement, and simply really volunteer editors, by the way they show up every day, the way they show up for one another, they make that vision and direction possible. Today, we're going to hear from two lines of research on this front that attempt to help us understand and have a better collective understanding of how can we be more inclusive and how can we open more doors to include more people within the Wikimedia movement. And without further ado, I'll pass it to Rosta to take us through her presentation.
Thanks, everyone. It's so great to hear about this initiative. I am even now more excited about Wikipedia. And yeah, so not a surprise that I'm a big fan. And thanks for inviting me to this talk. I'm really excited to share some of my work and hopefully get feedback and questions from people, both easy and difficult questions. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Hopefully that's gonna work. Okay, people can see my screen.
Yes, looks good.
And well, obviously this work is not just my own work. These are the team of people who have been involved in this project in different roles. And I've been very lucky to work with them all throughout. Particularly, I want to acknowledge my PhD student, Ang Lee, who has done a lot of the work in the first part of the work that I present with Zhang Gao, who is a PhD student also at Carnegie Mellon University. So I want to also start it by a little bit about myself and talk about the trail through my career. You will see that it's a trail, not a path, for people who know that difference. So I am originally from Iran, and I did my undergraduate degree in computer engineering at Sharif University of Technology. Then I moved to the US for graduate studies. There was a little bit of other things here happening, but I did my master in computer science in California State University. Then I moved to Pittsburgh to do my PhD, which I did in intelligence systems program. Then I wanted to get more experience actually in the social psychology and psychology sides of working with computational systems. So I did a postdoc with Dr. Bob Krott at Carnegie Mellon University Human Computer Interaction Institute, and then back again to University of Pittsburgh as a faculty. And now it's almost 10 years that I'm a faculty. I can't believe that's been so long, but it's happening really. And early on in my career, I read this book, Unlocking the Clubhouse, which was really an influential piece in my career. And I read it when I was a master's student, which I had a great advisor actually in California State University, people who really do help to bring this inclusivity. She was one of them, Dr. Hilary Holtz. And so since I read that book, that kind of became really a important goal in my career to this broadening participation, and has been reflected in my work in many different ways. And I'm going to today talk about particularly bringing new peoples in Wikipedia and ways that we can open the doors of Wikipedia to new editors. And I'm going to talk about two different approaches, that both of these approaches were actually not originated by us. We did kind of research to understand how those approaches worked. The first one, the Wikipedia education program. I was involved at the beginning of that program a lot in kind of formation of the program as well, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about is what was organized by Wikipedia education program. And then the other case of the arts and feminism edit-a-thons that Layla briefly mentioned that as well. So looking at Wikipedia education program, it really is a unique case of providing a lot of what we know in terms of institutionalized socialization practices that happen in offline organization. So this is basically, there are like 6 specific things that happen when people are brought into organizations. So as for example, we bring students in the universities, that's kind of a very good examples of these institutionalized socialization. Some important elements of those is that we provide them with a clear set of goals that they need to go through. We provide them with instructions of how to go through those steps. We give them feedback from experts. And one important factor is that we also create like a cohort, as opposed to people individually joining. We have a cohort of students who join at the start of a year. So many of these elements are actually implemented intentionally in Wikipedia education program. There is this clear goal, and for people that maybe have not tried, you can actually go to Wikipedia education program dashboard, and you see like that it's really well designed, actually set of instruction of how to kind of bring people to Wikipedia and what are the things that they need to do to become familiar. I actually just today started in my own class, having a class of my students joining Wikipedia classroom projects. There are support from the instructors, obviously, and also Wiki Ed staffs, and the students work work together as kind of they're in the class as a cohort who are now joining Wikipedia together. And not surprisingly, today, for example, in my class, none of my students had edited Wikipedia before, so they're all new. That was the first time that they were actually made any edits to Wikipedia. And we even have cases that within the classroom, there are a small groups, so even kind of a smaller cohorts that they work together. So what we were interested is to study the success of Wikipedia, so this Wiki Ed program, that these socialization practices, how do they actually influence some of the outcomes that we hope that it would achieve? So we looked at the data from 4 different semesters, from 770 different courses, and that included over 16,000 students who participated in all of these courses. And so to be able to study these success of the program, a big challenge was that what is our control group? Who do we compare this group with? And what would be kind of meaningful ways of coming up with a control group? So we designed 2 different control group and tried to kind of match on factors that we could match to create these pseudo experiments. The first control group is that we're a group of editors on Wikipedia who were new also to Wikipedia and joined us at the same time that our students population had joined. So we matched them on the same registration time, plus minus a few days. And so we looked at basically then their performance within the same time period that we looked at kind of a student's performance. So the average class time was about 80 days. So we defined kind of the same time period for this control group as well, and looked at kind of how does the student group compare to this control group. And we looked at particularly how much effort they put in terms of number of edits that they made, and also the quality, the changes in kind of article quality scores that made by our students group and the control group. And because we wanted to also look at kind of commitment and long-term effect of that, we thought that, okay, during the semester, the students are motivated through this extrinsic motivation that they have to participate. So we wanted to then see like, how does these practices influence maybe their longer term behavior? So our second control group was basically people who joined at the time that the students actually ended their classroom project. So here is looking at not assuming that the students ended from this moment, their socialization has ended, and we want to look at kind of how do they go on about their work. So the second control group was matched based on they starting at the time that our students ending their class, and then we looked at again the same kind of effort factors of how much work they did, and also then the commitment. So looking at the survival of the students versus these other control group editors. And here are the exciting results. So we learned that actually Wiki Ed program really was successful. It increased effort, it improved the contribution quality, and it did affect the long-term commitment. So within the classroom time, compared to first control group, the students edited 14 times more. And even compared to the second control group, after the class, the students edited 8 times more. In terms of the quality during the period of time, so articles that the students worked within that 80 days, we only did that quality comparison because we needed to have like a time period to look at that. So that wasn't possible to do for the other control group. Within that 80 days, the students improved the article six times more than the control group, and the students were 61% more likely to continue editing on Wikipedia. So we were also interested to understand what are some of the key ingredients that contributed to this. So we looked at the interactions and communication that were happening and looking at how does that mediate actually the result that we observed. And we observed that communications were actually really important key ingredients. And that's something in which we can take as a lesson of that could be kind of implemented in not only Wiki Ed, but across Wikipedia as well. So more communication between the students, which is kind of indication of that cohort support, really did help them to put more efforts and also kind of higher level of commitments and even improved quality. Sending messages to Wikipedians was related to also more edits and higher level of commitment. Receiving messages from Wikipedians was mixed results. And so these sending messages to Wikipedians and receiving messages is also proxy for something else. students were sending messages mostly to Wiki Ed staff. And so that was kind of, they were receiving the support, versus messages that they received were kind of from the broader community. And here is demonstration of what we mean by that mixed result. So Wiki Ed staff provided much more constructive and welcoming kind of responses to the students, as you can see in this first quote here, that nice work, and also kind of giving kind of ideas of what they can do, versus the comments from the broader community were not as welcoming and not as constructive either. So the second message that you can see is that's actually from the broader Wikipedia community and not from the Wiki Ed staff. So to just summarize this part of the work, Wiki Ed seems to be a successful intervention. It really produced both short-term and long-term benefits for Wikipedia. And these structured socialization strategies could actually benefit newcomers in online production communities. And we can think about kind of maybe different ways of implementing these beyond just maybe Wiki Ed programs, and also the importance of the communication, as I mentioned, in ways that, probably members can still work on having more constructive ways of communicating with newcomers, which this is really not new to anyone. I'm pretty sure everyone is familiar, but it's just useful to see kind of more evidence of that as well. So this attracting and retention of newcomers becomes even more challenging when we think about the issues of diversity that Leila just mentioned, and I'm so glad to hear that that's becoming even more of a focus for Wikipedia. So, for example, when you look at the gender identification, still and surprisingly, the studies that they first studied were from years ago, and these numbers have not really changed much, unless I don't have the final numbers. That I will be happy if someone can share that with me. But it seems that it's still only 10 to 15% of Wikipedia editors identify as female, and a smaller percentage of the edits are made by female. And to response of people saying, well, why is that a problem? That is reflected in the kinds of content that also exists on Wikipedia. For example, biographies of notable women still are much lower numbers. So I actually saw this as I was looking at what's happening, so that to a more recent study about data, which is not as recent, shows that in 2017, 41% of biographies that were nominated for deletion, they were actually related to biographies of women, and only 17% of the published biographies were actually about women. So this kind of diversity of participation could actually lead into content creation, which is also important. So one great effort that has been organized now since 2014 to bring in more women into Wikipedia is this art and feminism edit-a-thons. If you're not familiar with those, these are all-day events, sometimes even more than a day. Often these are organized in person. Of course, this is pre-pandemic life that were organized in person, but there were some online versions of that, though I would say that the online versions were really, really different. And what I'm going to talk about is all about the in-person events. And so the goal is to increase the coverage of female representation. So people who participate don't need to be women. It's more of caring about kind of this issue, but this is also designed to bring in more women. So in 2016, that's kind of the year that we looked at this data. There were over 175 events that were organized. They had more than 2,000 participants and edited about 33,000 Wikipedia articles. The data that we looked at were events that happened from January until March, which is the International Women's Day in March, and that month being acknowledged for that. And so we looked at the newcomers' editing behavior on Wikipedia. That includes how many edits they did they create their user page, did they create a sandbox page, any of those. And then also, again, at their interaction, both within Wikipedia, and here we also looked at the interaction patterns that happens outside Wikipedia, and Twitter as kind of platform that seems to be closely connected. So we looked at the official hashtag of arts and feminism, and now editing arts and feminism. And so then other associated hashtags that then included about 1,000 users who did about 3,000 tweets. Okay, so here the results of that study is that in fact a large percentage of people who participate in these edit-a-thons are newcomers. So in the ones that we looked at, there were about 1,000 unique users. 60% of them were newcomers. Participation within the events are very varied. So some events had only 3 people, other events had 130 people. And the percentage of newcomers also varied from 0 to 100% newcomers. And and these newcomers actually do a lot of work during these events. So in total, that 793 articles were created. And again, 60% of those articles were edited by newcomers, and about the same kind of percentage of actual edits were done by newcomers as well. So then we looked at also the subsequent participation a week after the event was organized, at what percentage of those newcomers continued. So about 9% of those newcomers continued. This number is significantly higher than a general trend on Wikipedia, which is about 1% of newcomers continue. And we looked at particular newcomers who joined around the same day to have that as a comparison point, but that's kind of the general behavior. Though still that 9% is also a small number that we hope that we can actually achieve much larger number. And so what we observed here is that communication was actually very little in terms of the newcomers did not really receive much of communication, either from the organizers or from Wikipedia in general as kind of the broader community. And that, again, that's kind of a place that could be improved and hopefully help with this retention of the newcomers. And similarly, when we looked at these kind of interaction that happened on Twitter, there people were tweeting, but these were like a lot of silos and isolated tweets that were happening, as opposed to maybe the organizer particularly kind of picking that up and building on top of that. So one of the things that, for example, we observed is that the hashtags that were used by the organizers were different than the hashtags that were adopted by the general kind of participants, especially when you look at kind of the afterwards. So you can see that there are much more diverse set of now hashtags that were adopted, and that's kind of a place that maybe could be utilized to bring in more people. So I think I'm reaching my time limit, and to summarize, so again, there are a lot of success in kind of what we observe in edit-a-thons as a way of attracting new members, particularly from the group that we hope that we can diversify their representation. It's not as successful in retention, and that's kind of room for improvement. And we think that communications could be a way to try to capitalize on this group better, and maybe really combining these two ideas of more socialization once we kind of get these newcomers. If you think about it, the first one is more about kind of onboarding, and the first one is about attraction, and these two really can be combined to maybe have even much more significant results. And in both cases, you can see that communication and interactions that the Wikipedia community has with the newcomers is still is kind of a source of a challenge for newcomers. And with that, I am done with my talk, and I welcome questions and comments and any feedback. I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Rosta, for this talk. Perfectly on time. There was even some extra time, but we have plenty of time for Q&A. If you have questions for the speaker, please put it in the chat. We'll relay it here to the audience. In the meantime, also to anyone here in the room, I'll open up the floor. Who wants to start?
I have a question, if you may.
Sure, go ahead.
You mentioned, first of all, great research. Honestly, really enjoyed listening to the presentation.
Thank you.
Kind of brought back the memories of the good old times of Wiki research. I just have a question about a very specific point I keep hearing over and over again in many presentations, and I read in many research papers before, about how bringing more women to Wikipedia affects the content of Wikipedia. This has always been something I am very dubious about. Like, people would say that if we, by the way, I identify as a woman myself, but I don't understand when people say, or researchers say, that if we bring more women, then we will have more content about women on Wikipedia. Like, how is that related to each other? I am, for example, for one, I am a woman, and I never really wrote on Wikipedia, and I was very active at some point in my wiki career. I never really wrote about women, not because I'm not like enthusiastic about the case, but it's just not something I want to write about. And I actually know, I remember that I read some kind of BA thesis, I guess before, that kind of was talking about the same thing and kind of established that the link between both of these, having women and having more content about women on Wikipedia, is not really highly established. Am I correct to assume that, or?
I think you raise a very good point. First of all, I think part of actually the edit-a-thon's events is it's open to everyone. So it's not just to bring women, but it's more of bringing actually people who care about content. So that those events are actually really advertised as focused on the content as opposed to the editor's identity. And that's, I think, really a very valid point. And the relationship that has been shown is more of, yes, those two exist. So we know that there are less women in Wikipedia, and we know that topics that are, for example, autobiographies of notable women are less, and people kind of naturally make that connection. Whether this connection exists or not, I think is really hard to study. I can see possibilities of maybe looking at the notable women articles and see how many people who participate in that are women, but even that really does not establish that. So I do think that really establishing the relationship is not straightforward, and it's an assumption that we make that maybe we should even question that assumption. But in any case, I would say that diversity brings diverse content. So even if it's not just about kind of notable women or particular topic, when you increase the diversity, you increase the content diversity as well. So that's kind of a relationship that probably is easier to establish.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for a great question. I'm now curious to kind of look at that. So I think I might start looking at that problem now.
I'll chime in here as well. I think I resonate with both of your comments. I will say that one study that we did a couple of years back, and I put the link here in the chat, and we should put it please on YouTube and IRC as well, is that we do see in the readership some signals, and this is on the readership, which is different than the editorship, which is the focus of this conversation, but we know that there are differences between readership and editorship. In the readership, we see some signals that women and men have different topical preferences when they are on Wikipedia. You can look at this as the fourth observation of that study that I just linked. Particularly, we had enough data to look at the biographies of people. So men tend to read more biographies of men on Wikipedia. Women tend to read more biographies of women on Wikipedia. We don't have this for all topics. We can't generalize it. We don't know what is the effect of it on editors when you come from readership to editorship, but there are some signals there. And also, while I'm saying this, I need to acknowledge that we did not have enough data to look at genders beyond men and women. That's explained in the paper, but that's the reason that I'm keeping the kind of the binary assessment as I'm talking on this topic.
Leila, I have another question to you. Just maybe you have addressed this in your paper. I will read it later. But how do you determine the gender of the reader?
So we run surveys on readers, and we ask them to share with us what is their gender, and then we connect that data to readership data to then see this response, which identified as a man, as a woman, or as a non-binary, what was the reader behavior on the site?
don't see the IRC. Are there questions there? I see, Pablo, you mentioned there's a question, but I don't know where to see the question.
Yeah, sorry. There is one question. Well, first of all, thank you for your talk. I also have my personal question. It was very, very interesting what you have been doing. So there is first a question on IRC by Sage Rose, saying like, did you account for students who take multiple wiki education classes over time, like another period of extrinsic motivation in the post-semester period?
So yes, we did control for there are actually no students that have like multiple representations, and we did control. So the analysis is also done as a panel data, including the students within a specific classes, within a specific instructors. So that also controls for even like students, maybe different students with the same instructors who took Wikipedia classes. So that's considered in the analysis. And the second part, you mean like the so were there extrinsic motivation within the semester?
Yes.
So the major extrinsic motivation is their grades, right? So they do it because they have to do it, and if the instructors had other motivations. So every course has a course page on the Wiki Ed dashboard. So we try to kind of collect information about the structure of the courses, though they're not reliable, significant kind of components that we could consider in the analysis. I don't think we observed any other extrinsic motivation other than the grades. And that's why we introduced a second control group to kind of account for the extrinsic motivation within kind of the class period time.
Thank you, Rosta. There is also one question by Marcel Miller on YouTube. First, he's saying, like, well, thank you for your valuable research. And he's asking, do you know what, if any, efforts in Wiki education are feminists to promote editor retention in the weeks or months after a newcomer's initial engagement?
Good question. I actually don't know the answer. I don't know if Wiki Ed follows up on the students. I know that they keep in touch as the instruction. They keep in touch with me all the time. So I'm assuming that they do some follow-ups, but not something for me to actually check in. I haven't heard of anything specific. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else here had the experience that can add to that.
If that's not the case, are there other questions in the room? Maybe we have time for one more question.
Okay, I can take it. So again, thank you for your presentation. Leila made a comment about differences in terms of mission these effects in editorship or readership behavior. Also, I really appreciate that you include, I think, the study of the art and feminism edit-a-thons data from Twitter for also trying to see other dimension. And that made me think an internal discussion we were having in the research team about indicators and how some realities are not being captured by indicators that are based on data that is hosted on Wikimedia. Like, there was an article some months ago already, written by Evelyn Heidel-Scan, talking about how much work is done in those edit-a-thons and some other activities that are not reflected in this data. So these are invisible. So I was wondering if you can join us momentaneously to that conversation and think other realities of these interventions that might be affected and might be relevant to be captured.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I saw yesterday on Twitter, actually, when the talk was announced, there was a comment which is very interesting that that kind of what we see as one option is to actually take the conversation out of Wikipedia or the maybe talk pages into Twitter and not make Wikipedia more social. And I think that's a discussion that has been happening from very early on in Wikipedia, whether talk pages are for social exchanges or not. And it has always been designed for not. And I think that's one source of then things happening outside Wikipedia. But this is pretty common in any platform. I don't think that's unique. Any platform that you study, you kind of need to start thinking about what are the Slack channels that people use. You know, people who have been looking at mechanical Turkish studies and mechanical Turkish, they know very well that the communication happens in a lot of outside channels. And so I think one is that there is no way of capturing all the data, and we need to admit that and be kind of open in when we talk about the data, but other ways also to try to kind of, as much as we can, think about the possible other channels. And then the other thing for Wikipedia is to think about maybe creating those connections in more clear ways, even if talk pages are not ever going to change to become more social. Maybe there can be a more direct link to a Slack channel or to a Twitter hashtag or other ways that kind of these now invisible communities become more visible. Though I know that it will have a lot of challenges, so I don't think that's as easy as just include a link and a hashtag.
Definitively. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation, Rosta. Maybe and for the discussion. If there's more follow-up questions, I think we can revisit after Nathan's talk. But in the interest of time, let's switch to the second presentation. Nathan, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nathan Matias, joining here from Ithaca, New York at Cornell University. And it's really exciting to have a chance to talk with you and share some of our work from the Citizens and Technology Lab. So can receiving a thank you note cause cascades of appreciation, where that person thanks someone else and then they thanks someone else in turn? And how can we answer questions like this and others with Wikipedia communities in collaboration? At Cornell, I lead the Citizens and Technology Lab, which works together with communities in ways you'll hear about. And this study is thanks to a remarkable collection and group of people across Persian, Arabic, Polish, German Wikipedias, including our liaisons. Some of them are here. Reem, Christine, Mohammed, Maria, Amir, Wacek, Mohsen, Natalia, and also the Catlab team, Julia, Max, and Eric. And what Catlab does is to work alongside the public to test the social impacts of digital power and also discover effective ideas for change. And even as I talk about this specific study, it's also hopefully the start of a conversation about how we do research on Wikipedia. So when Catlab does studies, our best projects deliver direct value to communities, advance scholarly knowledge in some way, and also have some kind of policy impact, whether it's government policies or the policies and practices of a platform like Wikipedia. And for scientists thinking about how this knowledge works, our approach is inspired by what social psychologists Betsy Pollack and Robert Cialdini call full cycle research. Our process basically involves having conversations with communities about issues that matter to them, carrying out some kind of analysis, often data analysis with permission, designing experiments together, and then conducting them in a way that produces both practical knowledge, as I said, and advances science in some way. And along the way, we often find ourselves creating software, as you'll see. So this study really started with a new feature created by the Wikimedia Foundation. In 2013, they created a feature for thanking people for their contributions to knowledge. You look at the revision history for an article, there's a little thank link next to specific edits. And when you click it, the author of that edit receives an alert and potentially an email notifying them of that person's appreciation. And at the time, especially when people are often more likely to receive negative feedback, as you saw in the previous talk, the foundation hoped to encourage a welcoming culture and provide a way to encourage contributors to keep volunteering. Now, why do people actually send these thanks, and do they do it? We actually started out in our project by analyzing data across Wikipedia and talking to community members at conferences like Wikimania. And even by 2017, thanks had become a popular feature, with one language community actually sending over 100,000 thanks in less than 4 years. So some people send a thanks because they like the edit, or they want to create a welcoming culture, or they want to encourage people to keep editing, and perhaps even steer editors towards editing things that were especially valuable. They were thinking, if I thank them for this, maybe they'll do more of it. So does this feature work? Lots of people use it, which is exciting, but does that activity achieve what people are hoping for? What does it even mean to ask if something works? In our workshops with communities, we try to write out our ideas for change using cards that look like this. We start with a goal. We then discuss a theory of change. Like, how can you achieve that goal? And that helps us think about possible interventions. What could we actually do towards that goal in line with that theory of change? And then, of course, interventions have a recipient, a person or a part of the site where the intervention focuses, and then outcomes, something specific related to the goal that we can measure or observe in the world in some kind of way. And when you do have a clear theory of change, you can then go to the scientific literature and ask, where is the evidence that could support our theory of change or help us think differently about it? For example, this paper by Jana Gallis in the Swiss Wikipedia tested the effect of receiving public recognition on newcomer retention and participation. The experiment assigned Barnstar medals to appear on the public profile of Swiss language editors who had made outstanding contributions to Wikipedia. Gallis found that retention rates increased by 7 percentage points in the first month after receiving the Barnstar. And it's a great paper, and there's more to look at. So how well does this research actually apply to thanks? So you might think, someone's getting a reward, they're getting an encouragement. Maybe we don't need to do a new study because we have the answer here. But there are some differences. Practically, it's easier to give thanks to more people, especially for individual edits, and to newcomers who may not have done enough on Wikipedia for people to think that they've reached the point where they've earned a reward. And then also social psychologists would point out that while Barnstars are public recognition and they relate to reputation and social pressure and all sorts of forces of that kind, thanks are actually, for the most part, private appreciation. You can dig into the API to find out who received thanks, but it's not quite as public as receiving it on your public page. So if thanks isn't recognition, how do scientists think about it? Research on gratitude emphasizes its role to kind of bind together our social bonds of reciprocity. You receive a benefit from someone, and you kind of partially pay it back through the feelings and the actions of gratitude. In fact, some social scientists talk about thanks and gratitude as supporting a system of hierarchy, because people with wealth and power are able to earn appreciation and obligation from those who are less well off. That kind of direct reciprocity system. But scientists have also kind of puzzled over whether gratitude just stays within those loops or whether it can break out. And Wikipedia ends up being a really interesting place to ask this question, because it's not a system for exchanging favors. It's a system of what people call generalized exchange or indirect reciprocity, where people contribute to a common good and expect to receive benefits from people who are different from the ones they help. I add to this article and I help these people, you add to this article and you help me. That's the indirect reciprocity scenario. And so if thanks is all about this direct reciprocity, then maybe thanking someone on Wikipedia might not influence behavior as much. It might not contribute to a kind of growing culture of appreciation. So even as there are practical questions for Wikipedians, there are scientific questions that social scientists can puzzle over in this area as well. So we had this question. Next, we needed to design an experiment. And at Catlab, that starts with the people we work with. So we identify liaisons, like some of the people here, and then we have conversations with our liaisons and through them with different language Wikipedias about whether they want to participate in the research, identifying the goals, defining the study, reviewing the ethics, implementing the study, and then also at the end of the process, we report back the results and make sense of them together with communities. And we also implement those studies using our research software, which collects data with community consent, coordinates interventions, and also manages research ethics. So we had, like, as an outcome of this process, a set of hypotheses that receiving a message of thanks or being assigned to receive a message of thanks would increase how long someone contributes to Wikipedia and increase the rate at which people send thanks to other contributors. We didn't know if this would be true, but these are our hypotheses, and our experiment would support or not support these hypotheses. And just a quick reminder of how experiments work. You have a population, some group of people, for example, newcomers to German Wikipedia who've made edits that are eligible for thanks. And then you randomly assign people to one group or another to receive an intervention or another intervention. And then you measure and compare outcomes to see what the effect was. And in this case, we assigned people to receive thanks or not to receive thanks and looked at retention over time and thanks sent over time. But there was a challenge, right? As we talked to communities and liaisons, they pointed out that we couldn't just like automatically assign people to receive thanks. Like if we did that, it wouldn't have the same meaning as a thanks message from another person who'd actually read the edit, paid attention to it, and thought that they should be thanked. So what could we do to design a study that could thank potentially thousands of people while still maintaining that community integrity? And so what we ended up doing together with our liaisons was to recruit hundreds of volunteers to do the thanking. So we created a piece of software that people logged into. They saw edits that they could potentially thank, and guided by the experiment design, sent thanks to people who were in the treatment group. And the advantage of this, especially the help of machine learning and heuristics, were that we were able to provide our volunteers with some level of discretion over who to thank, while also streamlining and reducing the burden on volunteers so we could present them with more thankable edits. And here's what that software ended up looking like from a user perspective. Volunteers would log in, they would authenticate to Wikipedia, they would then see a queue of edits that our software considered potentially thankable, and then they would have the opportunity to click the thank button, and through the API, that thanks would go to a participant in the study. So we ran the study from August 2019 through February 2020 and had hundreds and hundreds of volunteers sending thanks. And we actually included over 15,000 both newcomer and experienced accounts in the study across 4 languages. And there were several outcome variables we looked at, but we particularly looked at how long someone continued to contribute to Wikipedia. And we could talk more about the retention variable if useful, as well as the incidence rate of thanks sent out in the 42 days after receiving the intervention. And here are the baseline numbers for the control group. It is 16% of newcomers and 38% of experienced accounts were still editing Wikipedia 2 weeks later. And you can also see that if you compare the thanks sent between the newcomers and experienced, of course, experienced accounts, like we're sending more thanks to others, just more generally in the control group. So when we computed the result, on average across all languages, we found that simply being assigned to receive thanks increased 2-week retention of Wikipedia contributors by 2 percentage points across all of the languages, whether a person was thanked by volunteers or not. And volunteers thanked somewhere between like 15 and 30% of the people that we recommended. So the actual effect of receiving thanks is actually much higher than here. This is the very low conservative estimate because of the way we gave these volunteers discretion. Notice also that the largest effects occur in communities with the lowest retention rates. And this effect applies both to newcomers and to all contributors alike. And then we're also, as I mentioned, interested in this like scientific question on like whether you can create cascades of thanks by thanking people. We found that while prior research on gratitude has emphasized this role in kind of these loops of direct reciprocity, we see that thanking someone can actually cause these cascades of appreciation across newcomers and experienced accounts alike. Being assigned to receive thanks causes an increase in the thanks that someone sends by 1.6 times on average. And in over 99% of those second order thanks are sent to a third person, not the person who thanked them in the first place. And so thinking practically, this is good news for Wikipedia. Thanking someone can increase contributor retention, especially among newcomers and in contexts where retention rates are lower. Even better, thanking someone has these second order effects that they may thank someone and that will like spread the impacts over time. And comparing between languages, we did see there was some variation in effect sizes. And then also this point about small interventions can have large effects in contexts where those outcomes are more rare. Thinking about our scientific findings, we kind of broke some assumptions that especially sociologists have about the function of gratitude and its structure, that even in these contexts of indirect reciprocity, the structure of appreciation cascades might help explain how gratitude expressions encourage and sustain these public goods. And also, I'd like to believe that this also validates this process of collaborating with communities in the design and the implementation of research. If this study achieves community usefulness and scientific excellence, it's all thanks to our collaborators and community liaisons who spent years developing this together, some of whom are on this call. Finally, I want to say that we've received further funding from our grant funders to continue to collaborate with Wikipedia communities through 2023. And we'll be reaching out to communities for more conversations soon. I'm excited to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan, for these great results. And for the great presentation. We have a lot of time for Q&A. A reminder for everyone in the audience, please put your questions into chat and IRC will relay them here to Nathan and the team, and also to Rosta if you want to follow up from the previous talk. For now, I think we can start here in the room. I see Rosta is raising her hand already. Or is that a mistake?
No, but I wanted to give a chance to other people first. I do have a lot of questions to ask. But
no, please go ahead. I think we have enough time. And then if others want to chime in later, we can go one after the other.
Well, thanks, Nathan, for really, really interesting work. I particularly appreciate the way your approach to involving the community in your research. something for all researchers to learn from. So one question that I had was this intent being assigned to receive thanks. How did they know that they were assigned to receive thanks? So where they were selected in that interface, would the users actually know that they were selected?
Yeah, so the reason I used the language of being assigned to receive thanks, it's the language we use in a kind of experiment called an intent to treat experiment, where you randomly assign some people to group A and some people to group B, but you know not everyone is actually going to experience the thing that you want them to experience. Like, this is common in political science, where you knock on people's doors and you want to tell them something, but you don't know if they're going to open the door, but you can still get a causal estimate. And so the people who did not receive thanks were not aware that they were assigned to receive thanks. They just didn't receive thanks, right? Just like for a canvassing experiment, you knock on their door, they don't open the door, they may not be aware that they're part of the study until you debrief them afterwards. But for statistical reasons, you still need to include them in the analysis.
So then that's kind of a matter of quality of contribution. So then those group kind of the outcomes that you measured for them, how would that even be related to thanks other than their contribution is higher quality? So why not to actually have that as kind of control group, that some of these people randomly would then be receiving thanks and other ones won't, kind of then that become intense. So right now it seems like the control group could have had different qualities. So how did you then control for that factor?
Oh, we included, like, we used the same criteria to select the control group as the treatment group. So it sounds like there's like a methodological thing that we could talk about more offline. But you know, our pre-registration, our experiment design, and our preprint, and all of our analysis code is available publicly on the Catlab website. So happy to dive into the details.
Good.
But I think the shorthand is that we use the like standard practices of any kind of intent to treat study.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room who would like to chime in here?
Well, if not, there are some questions on YouTube. So first, thanks, Nathan, as a gesture of gratitude to you, of course. There's one question by Jonathan Morgan asking about how do we help the communities become more thankful in a scalable and sustainable way.
I love that question. And actually, I think this might be a moment to see if Reem and Moshe have comments on this. Both of them were liaisons. And one of the challenges that I think we actually wrote about this in a parallel paper is that all of this is work, right? It takes effort to edit Wikipedia. It also takes effort to engage in the socialization practices we've been describing. From my perspective as a researcher, by helping people know if their work is effective, we can help them decide where to put their effort. But I'm curious to hear if Reem or Mohsen has practical reflections on from your experience of organizing people to thank and other ideas as organizers on Wikipedia. Reem?
Hi. I'm sorry, I don't think I get the question on YouTube. Can you please repeat again the question?
Yes, sure. The question was about how can we help communities become more thankful in both a scalable and sustainable way.
More what? I'm very sorry. More what?
In a way that it is scale, but also is sustained.
More thankful.
Oh. Well, I'd like to take some moment to think about that. That's very tricky because as we figured out during our like work on the research with Nathan and Julia and Max, was that thanks can be a positive and a negative thing as well. You can use thanks basically to let somebody in the community know that you got your eyes on them, and you see what they're doing, and it feels kind of threatening. This is how, like, at least on the Arabic community, this is what I found out from many of the bigger contributors. So it's a very tricky thing, to be honest. I would need to think about that a little bit.
Thank you, Reem. Yeah, I think it's a helpful reminder. As researchers, we might be able to study the average effect, but systems and tools can always be abused. And that idea of threatening someone or like making them feel nervous by using a tool to like badger someone or I think is absolutely something we occasionally came across. And that's one reason I'm encouraged by the foundation's work on community, like network-wide policies. And I'm really hoping that we as researchers can help with that effort as well.
Or another good example of that would be like when someone makes an offensive comment, people are thanking them. So it is like a good example of misusing this thank button.
Yeah, that's a great example. Go ahead, go.
Sorry, I just want to ask a question of you, Nathan, on this topic, which is, as you know, we did also look into thanks in a smaller scale on a study a couple of years back on understanding the effect of thanks on retention. And we could also see that it creates kind of positive impact on short-term productivity of editors. So editors would contribute more. Of course, the quality of those contributions and whether those are whether you receive thanks as like a form of harassment and then you're activated to respond, or like otherwise. We didn't do the qualitative study, so I can't comment on that. In the absence of that information, would you recommend experimenting with making the thanks feature more visible and making it more visible to both editors? Because it actually takes a while for you to understand that, oh, this feature exists, and what does it exactly do? Like, is the information that you thank someone really publicly available? In what way? How can you see it? It's a relatively hidden feature. And I'll also take it one step further to ask, is it interesting to start looking at how readers can contribute to thanks to editors, right? So we know which editor has done which part of the text in an article. Yeah, I would be curious to hear your thoughts or others' thoughts on this.
I love it. First, I want to say I was super impressed by that natural experiment by Swati Goel. Like, there aren't many high school students who can do like a matching-based natural experiment on Wikipedia. And I hope Swati finds the time to like develop it into something that can be kind of peer-reviewed and published, because it's a great project. Although maybe you'll tell me it has been, which would be even better. So I think we're thinking along the same lines about interventions, right? Editors thanking each other has this effect. We have observational studies and now experimental studies confirming this. And I think, there are takeaways for different parts of the community, right? For editors, thanking people does have an effect. And so when you do it, feel like it's making a difference. For the designers of the platform, I do think there's a lot of value in making it easier and more visible. And I would love to like talk about a study around helping readers to thank contributors to Wikipedia. It's something that came up in our conversations with communities, that people who contribute to Wikipedia don't often have very much of a sense of what it means to people. Like you're trying to create knowledge, but knowledge isn't something that lives in a physical object or on a computer. Knowledge is something that like brings our minds alight, right? And for contributors to Wikipedia, I think there could be a lot of value in helping us all to better understand what it means to others. And I could see a thanks feature being a really powerful and simple way to do that. So if the foundation is thinking about that, or specific language Wikipedians are thinking about that, I'd be very, very eager to talk further. I think it's
May I add something to that?
Yes, please.
Please.
Yes, it does sound like a good idea in theory, but I would think in practice we have to be very careful about this, because at least from my experience in the Arabic Wikipedia community, people are not really that excited about turning Wikipedia into some sort of a social platform. They actually do like it the way it is, and they don't want to socialize that much with each other or with other people. They see the value of their work in the idea that I am making something that might help somebody in the future. Like, they don't even want to know if it did or if it did not. This kind of doesn't have a lot of that doesn't take up a lot of space in their mind, as they are actually actively contributing to Wikipedia. It's something that they started for just like giving back for the common good, for spending time, for like whatever reason that they really do not care, or not really, but like they don't really care that much to see how impactful their work is. Of course, this cannot be generalized, and I don't have any research to back this up, but whenever somebody suggests a step towards making Wikipedia a little bit more sociable, I kind of understand how me, along with other members of the community, would feel about that. Just a tricky thing to do.
If I may add to this, Reem, this is a really nice topic that you brought up. Thank you so much for sharing this. I'll say that I think we should understand that the solutions may not be global, right? Local communities at different stages of development in the projects may require different features, different capabilities. So we need to be kind of giving the communities kind of the choice for participation. I'll amend what I say to say, in the context of breaking the structural barriers that are keeping people out or not helping them to stay engaged with the projects, it is important for each of us in each position that we are to question some of the status quo, right? And say, what does it take to do an experiment and see what can we get, right? It can be that the existing community, let's say even the majority of the existing community, does not appreciate or does not want to have a thank feature, right? But let's think about 2030. We intend to include more people, engage them in the knowledge production and help them be productive. What if, and we don't know it, what if some of those people appreciate receiving a thanks, right? And then we can think about how to build the platform in ways that can accommodate that and also give the space to editors who don't want to, for example, receive thanks. But I think we are in this point in time that we need to constantly challenge the status quo questions and figure out, and the state, and figure out where can we experiment to successfully open more doors and help people be engaged in the projects. I would love to hear, if you don't mind, Reem, your reactions to this.
No, honestly, I personally like this a lot. Um, because it does kind of like push people out of their comfort zone a little bit, which might not always be a bad thing. Um, Although, again, from my knowledge of a lot of Wikipedians, they do love their comfort zone. They do not want to get out of it. And this always creates some kind of pushback against a lot of research efforts. Some research has been completely shut down because the community doesn't even want it. Um, so yes, I agree. I completely agree. Let's maybe try to push them out of the comfort zone a little bit, but very, very carefully because some of those people are key people in the community. So we don't want to just like push them out completely because they do contribute a lot and they do give a lot, and we don't want to lose them. So yeah, agreed, but carefully.
These are great discussions. I hear from Pablo that there's more questions on YouTube. You wanna?
Yeah, well, actually, there's a very relevant discussion on YouTube that I recommend you follow after the showcase. And some colleagues from the foundation are saying questions that I will share with you. Elias Akin Garmayer, he's asking to Nathan, like we often think about the effect of thanks on the recipients, but he's curious if you have thoughts or you have measured the potential impact on the person giving thanks. Like, for example, maybe they're more likely to engage with the person they thank at some point in the future. And the second question is from Marcel Miller from the growth team, also in the foundation. And he's imagining that some newcomers, they don't realize they have received thanks. So did you learn anything about how often this occurs or where newcomers do or don't see these things?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first one, or the second one first. For basically, because we don't have access to information about internal platform information about notifications, we were able to look into um, anything about who actually received the notifications, though that's something I imagine the foundation might be in a better position to look into if you have the records. I think that would be really valuable. And my guess is one of the things we're doing in our analysis before publishing is to do this kind of the second stage of the analysis. In these intent to treat studies, it's possible to even more precisely estimate the effect, not only of being assigned to receive thanks, but actually receiving it. And so when we do that, I expect we'll see a larger effect size. And my expectation would be that if we had data on who actually then received the messages, the effect size could be even larger. So the reminder that these are very low conservative estimates. I also love the question about the the experience of people who were thanking. So we did in fact design this study in a way that would help us learn more about the volunteers who were doing the thanking. And you can go into the Catlab site and look at the results of our study on mentoring, thanking others, and burning out on Wikipedia. And we surveyed people, we collected data on how much time people, or at least how many edits people contribute to talk pages and other social structures. We asked people survey questions about the experience of burnout and other things. And I think it gave us an interesting picture on the kind of experiences of people who do a substantial amount of the support work, a substantial amount of the work Rosta was talking about to socialize people and so forth. And there have been a number of studies qualitatively that have revealed just how hard it is sometimes, even though people really love it and are committed to it. And so I think, our takeaway from that, you can read in greater detail, but one of the big takeaways, I think, is that continued work on supporting those people and helping them feel valued and supported themselves, while also like managing the burden that people face is going to be really important to sustaining Wikipedia in the long term. And I know we're not the only people to have research suggesting that.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm asking one more time in the round. Maybe we can take another question or so if anyone in the room has more to ask, to share. And if that's not the case, I think we can wrap it up for today. We're also well past the hour. I want to really thank the speakers, Nathan and Rosta, for the presentations. That was really great. I really enjoyed those. I also enjoyed the lively discussions. So I thank everyone who participated in that, everyone here in the room, and also the people in the audience, also for joining and watching these presentations. I would also want to thank Pablo for taking the questions and the technical support we received from Jana, Leighton, and Brandon. So we could have the YouTube stream. That video will be available live for viewing later too. And with this, I hope to see you around for the next showcase in October, and wish you all the best for the rest of the day. And for anyone in the room, you can stay around once the stream ends.